Hey, 49ers, how's it going? I was just doing a little fishing here, finding ways to relax, and hopefully you're finding ways to relax too. Class, we only have one more week, well, week and a half left of class, so hopefully you'll either take another class the second half of the summer or find something else to do the second half of the summer. I think it's really important to figure out ways of distracting ourselves during this time. I find myself, if I don't get creative with finding ways of distracting myself, I end up going on the internet and kind of scrolling through all the sad stuff and scary stuff. But um, the purpose of this course, as I said, yeah, I want you to learn about perception, and I want you to appreciate perceptual skills that you didn't know you had. But maybe even more importantly, right now, given the context, is that I want you to see that your kind of intellectual curiosity can be a wonderful and productive way of distracting yourself in hard times like these. So hopefully that's helped, and you'll continue to do something like that through the rest of the summer until school starts in the fall, no matter how it starts. Okay. All right. So actually, we're going to be talking about fishing later, which is why I have this. But let's go ahead and start on today's lecture, unless there's any quick questions about anything. All right, let me get my silly hat off. And we can continue talking about touch. There I am. All right. Cool. We were talking about Rick Joy, as I last remember it. Yes. Oh, and I should mention, I'm realizing that, oops, sorry. I am going to have to go a little quicker. It's so many fun things to talk about, so many interesting things for me to talk about, and I can go on and on about all this stuff, but I want to make sure that we're able to cover all the topics. And you're so smart, given how you did in the last exam. I don't feel like I need to repeat myself nearly as much as I have been, especially since you have the recording. So I'm going to go a little faster, and I'm going to go through Rick Joy's story a little bit more quickly than I had been. So as I mentioned to you, I got a chance to meet Rick before he passed away. I think he passed away a couple of years ago, so he had another almost 10 years of very productive and satisfying life. And one thing he, besides working at Hewlett-Packard and receiving college degrees and all that stuff, he also was a amateur radio hobbyist. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, what that is, but it's a way, it's kind of an old way that people used to communicate with others around the world without using a telephone line, or back when I was a kid, not having the internet. People in the neighborhood would have these kind of elaborate radio sets that they would communicate with each other. And, it basically was just kind of a way of staying in touch with people around the world. And they have like these giant antennas outside their house, which Rick set up himself. And if people didn't know English, what they would use, or if people didn't know the languages of other countries, they would use Morse code. And that's the way Rick actually communicates with everybody through his hobby. How does Rick use Morse code? Well, you know what Morse code is. It's the series of dots and dashes that represent different letters. And Rick can't hear that. He can't see that on the internet or anything like that. So what he would do is he showed me how he did this. He had a little loudspeaker, and he could feel the vibrations of the dots and dashes that were coming through the loudspeaker that could be heard by people that have their auditory system intact. But for Rick, he was able to touch it and determine the Morse code that way, and he was able to decipher Morse code as well as anybody else could by feeling the speakers vibrate as they were conveying the acoustic information that he couldn't hear but could essentially touch in this case. He told me other things he did. At one point I was talking to him, and his daughter came bounding into the room, and she was on the other side of the room from where he was, and he said something to her, and she responded. And I asked, how did you know she was here? And he said, well, when especially someone like my daughter enters the room, I can feel the vibrations that are occurring on the floor of the room I'm in. Oh, so I already said he performs home repairs. So yeah, that's what I want to say. He feels the vibrations of the floor, the wooden floor especially, vibrating as somebody comes in and steps on it. And he also says that he can feel breezes when people pass by him on his skin. Kind of like, remember the old facial vision story, which we realized wasn't really true of how the blind were able to use sound. In Rick's case, he doesn't have sound, so he can use little breezes that are created as people kind of walk by him that he might feel on his face or on his neck. He said especially his neck, he'll realize that as somebody walks by, I guess the skin on the neck is especially sensitive for whatever reason to that type of thing. He says, I can sometimes tell when people are walking by me if they're walking by quickly, which is just amazing. As I said, he performs home repair and all that sort of stuff. So what I really want to do, though, is get into how Rick is able to perceive speech by touching faces. That's the most interesting thing. Rick lost his sight and his hearing at age 2, as I mentioned, and he started formal rehabilitation not until he was 11. So he went to a special school. This was actually the school in Massachusetts that Helen Keller was taught at, Pearson, I believe, and he started learning how to perceive speech through touching faces. And this is the famous Tadoma technique you learned a little bit about when you were going through that Helen Keller movie. So in the 1950s, Helen Keller had learned to perceive speech this way, being partly taught at the school for the blind and deaf. It was a school for the blind that also had the largest population of blind and deaf individuals in it. And you can see that the way she touches faces is a little different from the way Rick touches faces. And we'll talk about that in just a second. There she is touching the face of President Eisenhower. What Helen and Rick would certainly prefer to use when it comes to communicating people is sign language. Now, you know what sign language is, people using their hands and fingers to spell things out and more often actually representing words for things. Rick can't see this, of course, and Keller can't see this, but what they're able to do is hold the hands of the people who are signing. And that's been a technique known for a long time called tactile sign. In fact, Rick's wife is deaf, and so she signs, and the way they're able to communicate is by signing to each other, and Rick's able to understand his wife's signs by holding her hands, and they showed me how they did this. He holds her hands kind of gently. I think it only takes him one hand, and she'll sign into his hand, and they'll completely understand each other this way. He'll sign back, and she has vision, so she'll be able to watch him with his signs. The other way they can communicate is through text-to-braille devices. So these are devices that exist now that allow text, say in a book, to be created, to be implemented in braille. And Rick had one of these devices. I think Helen Keller ultimately did have one, but Rick showed it to me. It was a device that basically was a mechanical device that had little posts on it that would raise when when a camera encountered a letter or Rick's computer encountered text on the screen, and this little panel would create braille patterns to his hand. So I guess it had whatever the braille configuration is, I guess 6 different bumps or something like that. And those bump configurations would change very quickly as the text on his computer screen would be scanned, and he would be able to read what was on his computer screen through that device. It's how I originally communicated with him to set up our interview. I emailed him, and he was able to understand my emails because of how the text of my email was transcribed into this kind of a braille electronic device. He was able to tell that way. Let's go back to Tadoma. So Tadoma was, I should mention, named after the first users of the technique, Tad and Oma. They were the first recorded users, and it was a teacher for the deaf that taught them to touch faces and understand speech. Now, this isn't typically used very often these days. I asked Rick at the time how many users, that really relied primarily on Tadoma were there left, and he said relatively few as far as he knew. He thought there were maybe 10 or 15 users that really relied on it. Might be a little bit more than that. I'm not sure, but there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, there's fortunately fewer people that are both deaf and blind. And as I mentioned, there's various reasons for that. The MMR vaccine is one of them. And also people who are deaf at an early age are typically getting cochlear implants now. That was not something that Rick had access to when he was young, and he didn't want to do it when he was older. He thought, no, I'm doing fine. I don't need a device. And, his intuition was probably good. It doesn't work very well. Cochlear implant devices don't work too well with folks that are, in their 50s, 60s, that sort of thing. But these days, that's something that I do readily now with young people, especially I imagine if a child is deaf and blind, they will probably strongly recommend that they get a cochlear implant, and that will help them. They'll be able to understand speech fairly well after some experience with that. So there really aren't too many users anymore. However, it is an interesting phenomenon, and it's been something that's been really interesting to perceptual psychologists such as myself for a long time. So how does it work? Well, as you can see, Rick has a different technique from Helen, right? Looks like Rick, what he did, this is how he touched my face. He had his thumb below my lip and then had his fingers kind of touching my voice box down here. Helen did something different. You can see she had her fingers spread over the mouth. The typical way people are taught to do this, though, or used to be taught to do this when it was more common, is actually a little different from both of them. They would actually have people put their thumb across the lips of the speaker like this, and then have the other fingers kind of hold the jaw line here, and then the remaining three fingers touch the voice box down here. What seems to be critical is to know certainly what the lips are doing, and importantly, know what the lips are doing relative to the vibrations of the voice box. Because that relationship, what the lips are doing and how that is timed with what's going on with the vibrations down here, turns out to be very important. You can try this on yourself. Go ahead and try this. No one's going to see you. You have people do this in class, they get embarrassed, but hey, nothing to be embarrassed about. You're probably in your jammies, right? And if you do this, you can feel both of these things. You can feel the lips move. You can feel the voice box vibrate down here. And another thing about putting the thumb across the lips is you can feel air puffs in certain things. So if you go pa, pa, you can feel it like that. Okay, and that turns out to be useful information for a lot of people. Rick says that he's a little uncomfortable putting his thumb across people's lips, so he had it under, and he felt that that was just fine. He could feel little air puffs over the top of his thumb. I asked Rick, does it make a difference who you're tadomaing from? Does it make a difference whether they have a high voice or low voice or something like that? And he said, oh yeah, it does. Men tend to be easier to understand than women, and part of that reason is that their lower voices create a more, tactile sort of experience down for the voice box. Their voice box is vibrating more, so lower voices are easier. And he said the hardest by far is children. So before his daughter knew sign language, when I met her, she was 4 or something, and I think she was learning sign language pretty well. But he still did have to use his Tadoma technique to understand what she was saying. And he said that there's very little touchable vibration in their voice boxes. They're tiny little voice boxes. They don't vibrate very much. It's hard to feel through the skin, and so it becomes more difficult for children. In terms of the hand configuration, I just kind of went through that. It does, what's really important, I think we believe, is that, of course, you're feeling what the lips are doing and potentially the jaw, but the relationship especially between the vibrations and the lips turn out to be really important. In fact, if you want to try this at home, you can very slowly create a ba, like as in bottle, and a pa as in pie, okay? And if you do it very slowly, you can feel that there's a difference in the timing between when the vocal cords start vibrating and the lips part. So let me do ba. Ba. I can feel the vocal cords vibrating almost as soon as my lips part. Ba. Versus pa. Watch what happens. I'm going to do it really slow. Pa. Pa. The lips part, and then after that, the vocal cords start vibrating. In fact, you can feel a little puff of air instead of the vocal cords vibrating. Pa versus ba. So it's that, again, the timing relationship between what's going on in the vocal cords and the lips that's really important. And, you know, someone like Rick doesn't need that exaggeration that I just did. So you would kind of be able to feel the difference. He's able to feel that little delay much more easily and when it's much more subtle. And most of the teaching, you know, Rick told me most of the teaching involves the teacher kind of articulating and having little Rick's hand on her mouth and then switching. So, you know, he starts repeating what she just said, and the teacher has her hand on his mouth and kind of going back and forth like that. This imitation game allows him eventually to get better and better at it. Okay? I'm going to talk a little bit more now about the general kind of science of Tadoma and what might be going on. But before I do, if you have any questions, actually, before I won't go to the questions now, but if you have questions about Rick Joy, go ahead and write them down in the comments in the chat, and I'd be happy to answer them. People find him really interesting, and he was a really amazing guy. I mean, very bright. You know, I should just say this about my personal interaction with him. Before I met him, I have to say I had never met a deafblind person before, and I was a little worried that it might be kind of a, I don't know if I'd say upsetting, but, you know, kind of sobering sort of experience. Because you would imagine if you didn't have visual or auditory contact with the world, and especially with people, it would be a kind of lonely sort of existence. And I imagine that for some people that are deaf and blind, that might be the case. But for someone like Helen Keller and for someone like Rick Joy, that wasn't the case at all. He was lively, he was engaged. We had a really kind of fun and humorous conversation. He was a really funny guy, and he loved to laugh, and he was really connected to people, which was something. You know, it's like the human spirit to connect with other people is so great that at least in someone like Rick's case, he can overcome not being able to see, not being able to hear, and find other ways to make that connection, which I thought was really kind of beautiful. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about this. We've now know more about Tadoma, and I should say a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is research that was not done with deafblind people, but was done with normal sighted and hearing people that were just asked to perform the Tadoma technique. Now you're thinking, God, that's got to be hard. And I'll tell you, to get like to where Rick is, you'd have to practice for hundreds of hours, right? But even without that sort of skill, when you touch a face, you are able to perceive certain things, right? So you could imagine just sitting down and touching a face, wear a glove and all that, of course, and this is back when things were much safer. What people can generally determine right off the bat is like different vowels, oo, e, ah, that sort of thing, and even different syllables like ba versus va, ba versus va. If you do it silently and try to touch your lips, you might be able to really feel different. Yeah. Or even something like da. So ba versus da versus ga, I'm sorry, ba versus va versus da might be things you can distinguish. And in fact, the research suggests that novices that have never tried Tadoma, you know, with any sort of practice at all, in fact, can do that. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But one of the first things I wanted to mention is something I think is absolutely fascinating. Whether it's Rick sitting down to do Tadoma or yourself who's never done it before, when you feel a face, for the purposes of speech perception, trying to recognize syllables, trying to recognize vowels, Yes, the part of your brain that is responsible for touch does get activated. But guess what? Even though you're not hearing speech and you're not seeing speech, people wear headphones, they wear blindfolds, touching speech actually activates the part of your brains that are usually responsible for hearing and seeing speech. So you're not listening, you're not seeing. Again, you're blindfolded, you got headphones on that cover up any sound. But touching speech activates the parts of your brains that are typically used for hearing speech and seeing speech. And it doesn't make a difference whether you are Rick Joy or you're yourself who's never done this before for any, kind of practical reasons. It does the same thing. As soon as you touch a face and try to understand speech as someone's talking, okay, that information will activate the part of your brains that are typically used for hearing and seeing speech. That turns out to be a really interesting sort of phenomenon. And as we talk about kind of multi-sensory integration, you'll see why. But just at this point, realize this. You probably have never touched faces for the purposes of speech before, right? I know I never had until I started learning about this sort of thing. But if you were to sit down for the first time, touch somebody's face, your auditory and visual brain would treat that tactile, that touch input, as if it was heard or seen lip-read speech, which is, I think, just fascinating. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit more about Rick Joy. And by the way, I asked Rick if he's ever experienced this sort of thing, and what you're seeing here are three people communicating. Actually, this is a researcher right here. Who I know. And this is two deaf blind people, and they're having a conversation with each other where they're each touching each other's face. And Rick said, yeah, absolutely. He knows a number of deaf blind people around the country, and they get together and they share their experience and all that. And he's had many conversations where it's been three-way like that. That's about as many as you can do at one time. But he said, yeah, it's fun, it's comfortable. It's like having a. He says, I imagine it's like having a three-way conversation with any group of people that are hearing and seeing. So I thought that was really interesting. How much speech is perceived? Well, okay. There has been research done on people who are deaf and blind and have been using Tadoma most of their life. And as it turns out, an experienced Tadoma user, there's another one, experienced Tadoma user does pretty well. And I should say, this is my experience with Rick. When we were talking, I did have to kind of slow down my speech a little bit and maybe speak a little bit more purposefully. Sentences were shorter, that sort of thing. But he rarely asked me to repeat myself. In fact, this is what you find in the research, that they're able to, a Tadoma user is able to get 90% of sentences correct at slow speaking rates. And even, if they're not getting the full sentences, they're getting enough about, the topic of the discussion by the context of the information they can get. So they are not as good as a young, healthy hearing person would be in a quiet environment where they're getting 99 to 100% of all the words correct, right? But 90% is pretty darn good. I mean, I guess I would say it's like when you're talking with somebody in a cafeteria or at a noisier restaurant, and you do have to be a little louder, maybe, or not necessarily louder, but a little slower and be a little bit more purposeful in what you're saying. At that point, they're really good. So it's, that's kind of an amazing thing that he's getting all this information from touching faces. So as I say here, it's similar to being in a auditory speech experienced in the background of with noise in the background, like you would experience in a cafeteria or a noisy restaurant. So that's Rick's experience, and that was my experience as he was lip reading me by touching my face. Now I should mention, it was more difficult, I think, for me to understand him in some ways. So let's quickly talk about that, just as an aside. So Rick, as he learned to speak, so he could be understood by hearing and hearing people. He didn't have feedback. Okay, so someone who is someone who's normal hearing has the feedback of their own voice to hear whether they're clear or not. Someone who's deaf will typically look in the mirror as they're speaking to try to be as accurate as possible. So their feedback will come from seeing their face talk so they can learn to speak. Rick had neither of that growing up. And had been out of practice when I talked with him. He says that he doesn't do a lot of talking unless he's, with people that can only understand him that way. Most of the people he interacts with is through sign language. And so his produced speech was not very clear. I certainly had to ask him to repeat myself more than he had to ask me to repeat myself, even though he was touching my face, which is amazing. How about you? Could you learn to do this as well as Rick Joy? I've already said you actually are able to do this if you sit down in an experiment and try immediately. There are syllables and vowels and maybe even words you'd be able to perceive and distinguish. But could you get as good as Rick or Helen Keller or this person down here? And the answer is yeah, you can. Even though you're a hearing sighted person, if you were to take this seriously and give yourself about 100 hours of training, if you wanted to do this, and this was done originally back in the 80s for people who wanted to study Tadoma, and how it was done. They taught some graduate students to do this. And yeah, during the training, of course, they would be blindfolded and have headphones on so they couldn't hear a person speak. But during their normal day, they would communicate normally. They were hearing and sighted people. But it took 100 hours of training, more or less. And they were able to get about to 90% of the sentences at slow speaking rates, which is comparable to what Rick Joy has. So it's something that you could be trained to do if you wanted to. But even without the training, if you sat down and tried this for the first time, as I said, some interesting things would happen. One thing that would happen already is that your auditory and visual brains would respond as if you were hearing or maybe lip reading speech. But not only that, so we're talking about sight and hearing undergrads now. We're talking about intro psychology students that are the most typical subjects in laboratory research experiments. If you've taken the classes, and they would come in with no training, and they would be asked to touch faces, and then listen as they touch the face to speech that was spoken by the person whose face they were touching, but came into their headphones with a lot of background noise. Okay, so you're touching a face, and you're hearing somebody say simple sentences, but what you're hearing of those sentences, what you're getting through your ears, has a background of something like this. Okay, so it's kind of that noise sound that we've discussed a few times, and that makes it hard to understand. Right, so maybe with just listening and no touching, they'd get maybe 50% of the words correct in a series of sentences. But as soon as they touch the face as well as listen, their ability to understand what's being said goes up. It goes up somewhat significantly. So if you're listening to noisy sentences on their own, you say you get 50% of the words correct as the person is talking. Noise is coming through headphones. The noise and voice is coming through headphones. If you then touch the face, all of a sudden you're able to understand 70 to 75% of the words. Now, again, you can imagine being a subject in these experiments. You've never touched a face for purposes of speech perception before. But here you go, having never done this, never touched a face for speech perception, and you're already able to use that information spontaneously to help you understand the speech you're hearing through the headphones, that noisy speech. Okay, it's amazing. You've never done this before, but your brain's readily able to use the speech you're feeling, you're touching. Okay. The other thing you can do is actually help lip-read speech. So let's now switch the experiment. The subjects are there, and they're going to be touching faces, but before they do, they're no longer able to hear what the person is saying, okay, but they're able to look at their face. Okay, so there's lots of noise coming in, and they don't have the input of the person's voice coming through their headphones. They can't really hear anything useful. But they can see the person's face as they're talking to them, and they're asked to lip read as best they can. People aren't great at this. Maybe they get about a third of the words correct or something like that. Yeah, they're not terrible, but they're not great. As you can imagine, lip reading on its own is hard. But then if they continue to lip read and touch the face of the speaker they're lip reading, their ability to understand the words goes up again about another 20% or something like that. And so think about how strange this experiment is. You've never been asked to lip read before, and it's weird. And you've never been asked to lip read and simultaneously touch a face before, and it's weird. But guess what? When you touch the face, it works. It helps a little bit. You understand more. Okay, so again, never having experienced this before, it looks like your touch system and the brain area that are going to be used for this function allows you to use touch speech even though you've never used it before. Okay, it's just pretty amazing. And the last thing I want to tell you about this is that your brain seems to automatically integrate the speech that you feel with the speech that you hear. Now, later on, you're going to see, I already showed you this, the McGurk effect, where you automatically integrate seen speech with heard speech. Remember, we talked about that the very first day of class, right? Think about this as the same type of thing. Remember, we heard ba, 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 but saw ba, da, ba, ba, that sort of thing, and ended up thinking we were hearing what we were actually seeing. Think about the same experiment now, but you're blindfolded, and rather than seeing speech, you're touching the face of a speaker, okay? And the way this experiment's set up is people are listening through headphones the same syllable ba, ba, ba over and over again, but they're feeling a speaker simultaneously articulating different syllables with those ba, ba, bas. Okay, and it turns out you do get this sort of effect with feeling speech, right? So you believe you've heard ba, da, va, da, instead of ba, 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 based on not seeing what the person's mouth is doing, but feeling what the mouth is doing. And again, this is really, I think, fascinating sort of results because it suggests that your brain, your speech brain, is ready to take in any type of speech information, whether it's speech information that comes from hearing or comes from seeing, which you might not have known before, but it integrates what, that's that McGurk effect from before, or what it's touching. Which is just amazing because your brain, again, has not dealt with felt speech, I think, very often, right? But if at all, but the first time you try it, it seems to integrate with what you're hearing to induce this sort of influence. And so it's as if your visual brain, your auditory brain, and your felt brain are all working together and getting you the information for how somebody is articulating something, whether they are articulating a ba, a va, or da. And the speech brain is just ready to take in information. I'm happy with any type of information, regardless of which modality it comes from, regardless of which sense it comes from. I just want to know what's going on with how that person's talking. Okay? Cool. Let's take our little break here and see if we have any questions first. Any questions? Well, we have a smaller class today. Well, that's their loss, the people that aren't there. But let me see if we have any questions. Questions about Rick? It's a fascinating guy. I think it's an amazing story. Any questions about Rick? No? Okay, that's all right. If something comes up, as we go through the practice question, that's no problem. Feel free to ask at any time. I will always address the questions. So let's go ahead and do a poll question. Okay. Let's see. Did we do... Can't believe I remember. Yeah, no, we did do this one. Okay, so actually I'm going to still do Tadoma. It's easy. It's going to be very easy. But again, you get a free question for your exam. So here we go. So Tadoma is A, the technique Helen Keller used to perceive speech from individuals who didn't know sign language. B, can automatically integrate with heard speech. C, takes about 100 hours to master. Or D, all of the above. Oh my gosh, this one's easy. There you go. Good. You're all doing great. All right, just a few more seconds. By the way, I was talking to Serena yesterday, and she's going to be doing your little game show quiz on Wednesday to help you study for the exam. And she said that she gave you 90 seconds last time for each question, and I don't think you need that much. So she's going to be able to provide you more questions. So that was a minute, and it looks like most people were able to get that, at least that want to respond. So all of you got it correct. I will share the results. Yes, as you know, it's not a hard one. You just learned all this. Tadoma is what Helen Keller used to perceive speech from folks that didn't know sign language. It does automatically integrate with heard speech, which is just amazing. And it takes about 100 hours to master if you felt like you wanted to learn it. It's just a very simple, straightforward question. All of the above is the correct answer. All right. Any questions? Anything? Okay, we'll go back and share the screen and continue talking. You know, one of the things, I'm going to switch now. We're going to leave Tadoma. Before we do, just very quickly, I should say that before all this happened, all the virus stuff happened, and we had to close down our lab, we had been actually trying our first Tadoma experiment. I'm going to say, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think you might find it interesting. And we did have people come into the lab and touch faces. Again, this is before the virus, so we obviously can't do this now. Even if we can do experiments online now, we can't do this one until the virus is taken care of. But they would touch faces using rubber gloves. And what we were interested in is whether we could get speech that sounds like the speech you get from cochlear implants to be more understandable by training with touching a face. So just very quickly, the story is that individuals such as Rick Joy, who might get a cochlear implant later in life, actually, it's even younger than Rick Joy. Like teenagers who get cochlear implants sometimes have a difficult time using them. If you don't get it early, it can be often not very useful. And so scientists have always looked for ways of making that cochlear implanted speech more decipherable, more understandable. It sounds pretty awful. It kind of sounds like, sorry for the noise, but it sounds kind of like a really awful Donald Duck recording. If you remember Donald Duck, right? The idea is to somehow figure out ways of training people to better use that. And as it turns out, lip-read speech doesn't do a good job training because people who are deaf and then get their cochlear implants, they've had all this experience lip reading, so they rely on that during the training. So we decided to use Tadoma to see if that could train people to better understand that noisy Donald Duck cochlear implant speech. We hadn't tried it yet with actual cochlear implant users, but what we did is we brought in undergraduates, intro-psych students, and played them speech that sounds like cochlear implant speech is thought to sound. So it's this kind of weird filtered speech. It's not very understandable. And they have a difficult time understanding it just on its own. And then what we did is we had them listen to that speech as they felt the face of the speaker actually producing that speech. So the speech came through a filter to make it sound like Donald Duck. They then felt the face as they were listening and tried their best. And then later on, they got tested again on just the noisy speech. And as it turns out, it did improve their ability to decipher that kind of weird cochlear implant noisy speech a little bit better by touching the face for the training. was interesting. It looks like, we have to do more research on that. We have to, of course, test it on real cochlear implant users, not the kind of simulated ones we did with the undergraduates at UCR. But it potentially might be a useful way for allowing individuals who aren't able to use their implants well to better use their implants. Okay, so touching a face during training allows you then to better hear a cochlear implant speech later on. Okay, thought you might be interested in that. But now let's switch. Let's switch topics. We'll move away from Tadoma. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting aspects of touch. When we think about touch, and when you first learn about touch in a perception or undergraduate class, most of what you learn is about how the skin works as a touching system. Okay, and it makes sense. That's our intuitions about how touch works, right? And we talked about this already in the context of plasticity and John Bramblett and as the painter touching paints and things like that. But as it turns out, our touch system is deeper than this, and that we probably use the deep aspects of touch more than we use the skin aspects of touch. What do I mean by that? What I'm talking about here is the touch system that exists deep under the skin. And that is what we'll call the muscle tendon system. So we kind of lump this in together with touch. It's sometimes called something else, kinesthetic perception, that sort of thing. But we'll lump it together and just talk about it as a muscle tendon system. And you might have learned this in an anatomy class, a health class, or something like that. But, where your muscles and tendons are, we have little sensors that can tell us what our body is doing. Okay, so we have little sensors in our muscle to tell whether the muscle is being stretched or whether it's being, what's the word? Bunched up. I can't remember the word, sorry. But we also have sensors in the tendons that, are at our joints and things like that. So that's what this is showing right here. Contracted, that's the word I was looking for. Okay, whether our muscles are expanded or contracted. We have sensors in the muscles themselves and right here in the tendons that connect the muscles to the limbs at, joints and that sort of thing. And these important sensors here go up to the spinal cord and many go to the brain to tell our brains what our body is doing at any one time. So, to know that my arms are stretched out, yes, I did command them to do that, but even if you were here and posing me in different sorts of positions, I would know where my limbs are based on these muscle tendon systems. Okay, so this is a way for me to know what positions my body is taking and how my body is moving. As it turns out, it does more than that, a lot more than that. It can tell us about things out in the world. It can be a means to perceive objects. And here's what I mean by this. Imagine, let's see, I'll use something like this. Here we go. I'm going to pull my own image in a little bit so I can make sure that you're seeing what I'm seeing. Okay, here's an object right here. And imagine I'm giving, this is given to me in my hand, and the only thing I can do with it is just rock it back and forth. Okay, rock it back and forth like this. I would be able to tell you the length of this rod, okay, the general weight at the end of the rod, as well as the fact that the rod is differentially weighted. The weight, this is heavy, by the way, this little clamp here. The weight is not distributed evenly across the rod. It's more on one side, really, this sort of thing. I can tell you the weight is definitely to the right side. And that's what these sorts of experiments absolutely show. So basically, don't worry too much about the technical aspects of this image, but basically, this is what I was talking about right now, that a rod is put into somebody's hand that they cannot see, and then they're asked to do things like judge the length of the rod, where they grip the rod, and whether the rod is bent or has a weight on it and that sort of thing. And then in this particular experiment, as it's portrayed, I just stole it from a paper, they're judging the length of the rod not by saying how long it is in feet or meters or anything like that, but moving a board back and forth that indicates where the rod's end would be if they were to put it all the way out. It's basically just a means by which they can convey to the experimenters how long the rod is that they're perceiving. Okay, so don't worry about that aspect of it, but do worry about that the fact that all of this information, whether I'm gripping it at the end, whether I'm gripping it in the middle, what the length of this is, and whether there's a bend, and I guess we can consider this type of thing a bend, all this could happen just from moving the rod up and down. So what is going on here? Well, yes, my skin is touching this, but it really isn't changing as I'm moving it back and forth. Yeah, there's a little bit of a change in how the skin is stretched a tiny bit. But even if you were to kind of, counteract that some way, the way in which you're feeling all of these different object properties are through the tendons here in the related muscles the sensors in the related muscles and tendons of my wrist. So if you were to do an X-ray right now on my wrist, or I guess an MRI would be the way to do this, you'd see the muscles, you'd see the tendons, and you might even be able to see the little sensors inside those things. Those are the sort of organs that are allowing me to tell what's going on with this object. And this is what I mean here by feeling things without touching them. I mean, I'm not in skin contact with all these properties. I'm not in skin contact with the length of this rod. I'm not doing this type of thing, right? I'm not in skin contact with where I'm holding it. In other words, I don't know just by my skin where I am on this rod. And I don't know which direction the weight is in, if there's a bend in the rod, based on what I'm contacting in skin. What's going on as I move this back and forth is there's kind of like a change in the muscle lengths and the tendon lengths as I go back and forth. They're kind of deforming as I move these back and forth. And the sensors in those muscles, the sensors in those tendons are telling my brain something about this object. Let's think about this. This is not something that is just done with rods like this. This is something that we do every day. So here we go. That's something I used this morning. This is prop day. See, and people that aren't in class today are missing prop day. Now they'll get it on the video. When I pick this up, without looking at it, I know something about it. So if there's coffee in it, I'll know that it has a certain amount of fluid in it. I can move it back and forth and know that there's fluid in it, right? And I don't need to look at it to do so. And typically when I'm pouring my coffee or picking up the coffee, I'm doing something else, maybe looking at my phone. You guys know about this. My son, my 18-year-old, it does all this stuff as he's preparing his lunch with one hand and looking at the phone with the other. I don't know. I guess it's successful multitasking. Let's be positive about that. But, we all do this sort of thing. We're all, sometimes not looking at the sort of, behaviors that come second nature to us. But to determine all that stuff, we are, again, even without necessarily moving it back and forth, we're getting information about this object and its properties based on how the little tendons and muscles are changing as the sensors convey that information. Okay, it's pretty cool. So anyway, what I want to say is it seems kind of a weird experiment to kind of move back and forth these bars with weights on them and all that sort of stuff. But what I'm trying to convey here is that this is something we do all the time. Every time we pick something up, including our phones, right? We are in fact getting information about where we're gripping it and how much of the phone is outside of our grip and all that sort of thing by doing this. I mean, think about it. You can close your eyes, grip your phone from, pick it up, grip it, and know all this information, even if you're just touching it with a very little piece of your fingers. There's very little skin touching this right now, but boy, do I know how much pressure I need to keep it gripped and what part of the phone I have, and I can, without looking at it, set it up and get ready to read stuff on it. We're doing this all the time is what I'm trying to say. This happens all the time. Every time you grip something, you're getting information about that object from the muscle and tendon sensors. Okay, what else can you tell? Well, I think you're going to find this really cool. You can tell something about the shape, not just with the way things are angled, not just things that are differentially weighted, but the real shape of something. And let me see, did I put this down? Yeah. Can you see this image down here? Yeah, it looks like I can. Yeah, okay. So this is the experiment, and it is pretty cool. And I always think this experiment is so cool. I was a subject in this experiment when it was run when I was in graduate school. But here's your job. You have a set of shapes that you can see, and you're not going to be touching them. They're all kind of put on a table. Here, I made one for you. Oh, shoot. I thought this was going to work. Oh, this doesn't work. This isn't bad. Okay, I made one for you out of the box for the coffee pot. So imagine you see a whole bunch of shapes like this that are sitting at a table. There's a cube, there's one with a cube, there's one with a pyramid, one with a cone, one with a cylinder, one with a semicircle, it looks like. And you're looking at these, and they're just reference shapes for you. They're going to be the ones that you're going to use to point at. But behind the screen, as you can see, someone's going to hand you basically exact copies of the ones you can see. And your job is just to grip the object's handle and then move it up and down this way. I'm so proud of myself. I made this morning right before class started, and it actually works pretty well. And I'm going to move this back and forth like this, and my job is to say, which of the objects do I think I have? Okay, do I have the sphere, the semisphere, the cone, or the cube? And I'll point to one, okay? And they say, okay, thanks. And they then take it, and then they give me another object. And the deal is I'm always going to be grabbing the handle, never touch with my skin the object itself. But now say, you have to imagine this, it's no longer the cube, it's now a sphere that's kind of equally sized, and the handle is now at the bottom of the sphere, and I'm just now in skin contact with the exact same thing, this wooden handle. My skin never touches the object, but just by moving it back and forth, I can say, oh, it's not the cube anymore. It is, in fact, the semicircle or the sphere or something like that. And people are surprisingly good at this. And imagine you come into an experiment, you're going to say, we want to see if you can feel the shape of objects with not actually touching them. What? Say, we're going to give this handle to you, and you're always going to you're actually always going to touch the same handle. But you're going to hopefully know something about the shape just by moving it back and forth, and people can do this. And they can do it not just across different shapes of roughly the same size. They can do it in different sizes. So they did an experiment where they actually gave them small versions of each of these objects to kind of shake back and forth. Again, they only touched the same wooden dowel case, one trial after the next, but they were smaller objects, and they pointed to these large objects like they had pointed to before, and they can do it across sizes as well. They don't have to be the exact same size. People can tell shape in a way that generalizes over size. So, I mean, I just think that's amazing. I was amazed that I could do it. I thought this has got to be the strangest experiment I've been in, and I've been in a lot of strange experiments, but I was like, wow, I can really actually do this. It's pretty cool. Yeah, it works. And what you find is that people are certainly better than chance, and sometimes I was absolutely correct with every time I got the cube, I got it absolutely right. How are we able to do this? It's a little technical. I'm not going to get into the kind of the details, but as you're moving things around like this, what's going on is the object's properties are going to set up a kind of a different set of resistances as you're rotating. So as I rotate back and forth this way and this way, the resistances to rotation, how much effort my wrist needs to put in, my muscle system needs to put in, is going to be something the brain can use to determine the shape of the object. So generally it's thought that what we're perceiving, although it's not kind of experienced as this, what we're perceiving are the resistances to how the object can rotate as we're moving it back and forth like that. So it's thought that that's how the brain is able to interpret things like the shape of an object based on the rotation you're doing here. If I had a pyramid on the top of this, or a sphere rather than a cube, it would have a different set of resistances to this rotation here, and I'd be able to pick that up with these little sensors in my muscle and tendon system. Pretty cool. I'm just amazed at this research that people can be so good at it. For example, I don't know if you are tennis players or hockey players is the other thing. I know there's not a lot of hockey down here in Southern California, but maybe you play tennis as a hobby or did it in high school. My son did it all through high school. Might do a little bit in college, we'll see. But, you know, we had to get him lots of different rackets and you know, throughout his years playing in high school. Kind of expensive. I don't know if you're aware of that. But you know, one thing that we were always interested in was what was the best racket for him, and the teacher would help with that, but he would also have to kind of help determine that when we go to the tennis racket store. I don't know if you know this, but you often have to get, when you get to be a senior non-varsity and you play, you know, competitive, you have to get 2 of each racket just in case one breaks during the game, and so it can get very expensive. But one thing you need to determine when you're choosing a racket is something called the sweet spot, and the sweet spot is the part of the racket that is going to give you the best hit. Okay, so you know, it's kind of a physics question. You know, where in this are you going to get the best hit? So, you know, it could be up here, it could be down here. It really has to do with the dimensions of the racket, where you're holding it, and all that sort of stuff. But as it turns out, the best way to determine the sweet spot is, yes, you can play, but more than that, even better than that, is not looking, but actually doing this. Okay? And so you see my son, he goes in, he's looking for a racket. This racket's kind of disappearing because it's the same color as my green screen, but you get the idea. Yeah, look at, there's no webbing on it. Anyway, he would go to the store and do this sort of thing and get an idea of where the sweet spot of his racket is. And as it turns out, yeah, he's good at it. He's, you know, put so many hours into playing tennis. But this is something we can all do. And in a series of experiments, novices, people who had never played tennis before, were kind of put in the same sort of experiment that we saw earlier, this guy here, where you are sitting on one side of a board and your arm's on another side of the board. It's kind of hard to see from this image, but you know, I'll just kind of mime it for you. So I'm over here. There's a board over here. I can't see this racket, but I'm asked to kind of wield the racket back and forth, rock the racket back and forth. I can't see anything over here. There's a big board. And on this side, what I would do is I would just move a tennis ball back and forth and tell you about where the tennis ball would be if I was hitting it with my sweet spot of this racket. In other words, without any sort of formal experience with tennis, people can tell, you know, the best location to hit the ball in. You know, it's going to be somewhere up here, but again, it's going to depend on the weight of the racket, the width of the racket, all these different dimensions. Same exact experiment can be done with hockey sticks, and I think that one actually was done. They wanted to see if you know, the hockey team on campus was able to do this, so they used you know, kind of practice players, and they were asking, where's the best place for you to hit the puck? Here's a stick, here's a different stick, here's a different stick. Where would you want to hit the puck given these different sticks? And they were wonderful at it. They you know, this could be measured by the, you know, the dimensions of the hockey stick or the dimensions of the tennis racket to know physically what the best place actually is, and people can feel those spots just by moving these objects back and forth like this. Also applies to hammers. I should have had, of course, I'm in the garage, so I have tons of hammers around, but I don't need to bring this out. Whether you're trying to, you know, hit a nail, a hard nail into hardwood, so you need really powerful hammering, versus, you know, kind of just trying to get a nice little, getting a tiny nail into, you know, a nice piece of wood so it looks good. You know, you need precision hammering, and people, regardless of their experience with hammering, are very good at knowing where they would best be able to grip that. And again, it's not seeing the hammer. All these experiments involve just people moving things up and down, and they're able to do that in all those cases. And then finally, this last thing I wanted to say about all these experiments where you're using your tendon and muscle systems and the sensors in there to determine things, determine object properties, don't have to be done with the wrist. All these experiments can work with moving the object down, up and down with other sorts of things. And so you can, in fact, connect this to somebody's foot and have them sit on a high chair and move it up and down like this. And now what they're doing, of course, is not using their wrist, they're using their ankle to determine these things. And people aren't quite as good, but they are certainly good enough, better than chance certainly, at determining these things like, where their ankle is attached, where their foot is attached to the bars, how long the bar is, and whether the bar has a shape or a weight on it or something like that. It can be also done with very small objects, if you're kind of twiddling back and forth. So the sensors you're using here are the sensors that are associated with the muscles and tendons of the fingers. And you can tell that sort of thing like this, yeah. That sort of thing. And, in other words, this is not something that's special to your wrist. It's easiest to set up experiments that involve the wrist. But the tendon muscle system in your body has these sensors that do very sophisticated analyses, such that not only do you know the positions of your body parts, you can know what you're holding, what objects you're encountering by how these tendons and muscles are deformed. Okay, cool. Not a bad place to, I guess, take a very quick break. See if there's questions here. Any questions on this one? Any questions on the muscle tendon system? No? All right, let's ask a quick question. Cool. Yep, here's one on the muscle tendon system. Let's see. Should be easy. Oh, hold on. Do I want this one? Yeah. No, let's do this one. Sorry. Yeah. Here we go. So what can be perceived using your muscle tendon system? This is so cinchy, but you get a free question. A rod's length, an object's shape, an object's color, or both A and B. Okay, should be easy. Good. Give you another 30 seconds or so. Okay, that's good. All right, most people got it right. Well, yeah, half people got it right. All right, let's take some time and go through it then. The correct answer is actually both A and B. And what you want to think about here is certainly the rod length is something I've discussed over and over again, how long the rod is. That is correct. So if there was no weight on here and I had to determine how long a rod was, and then remember move that board to indicate that, yes, it's something. It's one of the first things that the researchers were able to tell, that subjects were very comfortable giving you a judgment of the rod's length based on just moving it back and forth like that. But also an object's shape, and what I mean by that is this experiment where people are judging the shape of something connected to a rod or a handle. In this case, they can tell the object shape whether the object shape is a cube or a pyramid or a sphere or anything like that. So that gives you some idea of how to remember that. They can't tell the object's color. That's a FOIL question answer. So the correct answer is both A and B, and about half of you got that right. Okay, cool. Any questions on any of this before we continue? I realize I'm going a little faster today, but you're so smart, it's not a problem. Okay. This will allow us to kind of tell a couple of anecdotes, though, now. And what we're going to be doing is talking about fishing. I told you we'd be talking about fishing eventually, and we are now. So I had a chance to interview this really interesting guy, real nice, interesting guy called Rick PSYC. There he is. And he's a fly fisherman. Now, I don't know if any of you do fly fishing. I've never done it. I grew up doing fishing, when I was back in the Northeast. We had lakes, and it was, one of the things we do at camp and all that sort of stuff. But the fishing I would do is, I would cast the line out, and wait for a fish to nibble it and then pull it in. Fly fishing is so different from that. Fly fishing involves having a line that actually floats on the water. So it's a very different type of fishing line. This fishing line here is thin, cannot really float on the water. It's not meant to float on the water. It's meant to be drawn down by the weight of your lure, the hook, the weights, the worm or whatever you got on it. His fishing line is made of a plastic that's designed to float on the water, and at the end has a little fake fly on it. It kind of looks like the fly that has hair on it or something. You may have seen these sorts of things. And in addition, not only does the line have to float, but he has to cast really, really accurately. When I was a kid, you would cast where you thought the fish were. What he's going to be doing, because he's actually fishing in shallow water, is casting to a very specific spot and then letting the floating line kind of move over there with the fly, the actual hook with the lure resting on top of the water. And he says it takes a long time to learn how to cast. It is not something that you can do easily. In fact, what they do is it's shown here in the picture of him. They don't, the way, I don't know if you remember this, what you would do with a fishing, like kind of more standard fishing pole and its reel, is you would either push a button when you cast out so the line would then, unfurl out, or hold the line, let go very quickly. But what he does is he first brings out a whole bunch of this plastic line, so he has a lot of it behind him, and he kind of goes back and forth like this for a while, so the line kind of follows back and forth above where his pole is. And when he feels he has a good control over it, he will very quickly then flick his wrist, and it will allow him to get the line and where the lure is, the fly in front, exactly where he's seeing the fish in the water. Okay, and he gets glimpses of the fish. A lot of times he's not able to see the fish, and I'll talk about that later. But if he sees where there's been a couple of fish before, he can be very accurate where he's throwing that line. And I asked him, I said, does that take a long time to learn? He says, oh yeah. He's a teacher. When I bring people out, that is the thing that takes them the longest to learn. It can sometimes take multiple lessons for them to feel comfortable just getting the line out there and not getting tangled in the line themselves, and then to get accurate, that could take another few days. And I said, do you find people who have regular fishing experience like me? I did it when I was a kid and did a little as an adult with my own kids. Do you find that that having that experience helps? He goes, absolutely not. Those are sometimes the worst at fly fishing. I said, well, who are good fly fishermen? And he said, well, believe it or not, some of the best fly fisher persons I've had are women who have experienced dancing, of all things. And he kind of thinks of this casting more as like a ballet move than an actual kind of regular fishing move. There's kind of a rhythmicity to it. They have to kind of learn to kind of put their bodies into a coordination where they're kind of, kind of set to a rhythm so then it allows them to have control over the line. So he said, I'll find that these women who are, kind of avid dancers, whether professional or they go out a lot on the weekends and just love to dance and feel very comfortable dancing and practice different moves sometimes, those are the ones that are best. It was really interesting kind of insight. I had never thought about that being the case, but it's interesting. What I was most interested in, one thing I should just say about that is relevant to what we're talking about now. He says that touch plays an important role in casting, in that you have to know when the line is stretched out behind the rod. So as I'm doing this back and forth, and I'm holding the line like this, actually, you have to know when the line is stretched all the way behind and is completely unfurled behind the rod before you put it forward and then let go. And that does take a sense of touch, because you're going to feel the line kind of being pulled tight in back of you through the rod, and also your fingers are going to be able to feel that too, but through the rod mostly. Okay, so I asked him, how does touch play a role here? He said that's one way touch plays a role. But another way touch plays a role is absolutely fascinating. I think you'll find this really, really interesting. He can, after the line comes out and he's waiting for the fish, he is looking at his line. But when the lure is taken, when a fish grabs that little fly and maybe gets hooked on the hook that's under the fly, okay, he feels it in the rod. He feels a little jiggle. And that jiggle can give him so much information about what's going on. First, I should say everything he does and everything he teaches is catch and release fishing. Okay, so they don't catch and then eat. They catch. The fish comes in. They take the hook out and they say, "Okay, there you go, fish. Have a great time." And it, he just really has no interest. He doesn't even like to eat fish. He just likes the kind of the sport of it and enjoys the relaxation and teaching people to enjoy it. But that fact's going to play an interesting role. It means that there's a lot of smart fish in the rivers where he's fishing. These are fish that have tricks, that have been caught a number of times and have tricks to kind of stay away from the lure, or if they are in fact hooked, to get the hook out. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But as he first feels that little pull on his rod, like this, little pull on the handle of the fishing rod, he can feel a lot of things. He can feel things such as the type of fish, the type of bass. So he fishes in rivers, I said, and he's fishing a lot for black bass, rock bass, big mouth bass, all these sorts of types of bass usually. He can tell what type it is based on how it jiggles the rod. He can tell what gender it is depending on how it jiggles the rod. The type might be something having to do with how it feels in weight, or it might have to do with how strong the jiggle is. The gender too, generally he will say that the male have more muscle mass, so that the amount of jiggle will tell him something about that. The age of the fish is something he can tell by what the fish then does after it's hooked. As I said, a lot of these fish are really clever because they've been hooked before. And if he feels that the fish is going down deep into the depths of the river, he'll know it's an older, more wise, and experienced fish that he then actually has to behave with a little bit differently. And what I mean by that is, as soon as the fish goes down deep, as soon as the fish starts diving into the water, what the fish is going to do is then come up really, really fast. It's going to shoot up like a rocket through the river and come out of the water and kind of bound out so it's in the air for a little while. And when it does that, it's able to give a little slack in the line and will have its best chance of being unhooked. Okay, so the fish knows this. I mean, it's been hooked a number of times and knows, okay, last time I did this, it worked. So they try to jump out of the water, and because of that, they get a slack in the line, and the hook will sometimes just fall out of their mouth, and they're fine. So what he does and what he teaches people to do is something very interesting. He said, when you feel that fish diving down, so like this, I guess, right? When you feel that fish diving down, what you need to do is bow down like this with your rod. So what I'm doing here is I'm going, okay, as soon as you feel that, bring the tip of your rod down to the ground. He called it bowing to the fish. So you can tell this is the direction of the jump, right? He calls it bowing to the fish like this. And what that does, by bringing the rod tip down like this and kind of pulling in the slack of the line, when the fish then jumps out, they'll have less of a chance of releasing the hook. They'll have less of a chance of being able to swim away. But he has to be able to feel all this through the rod, which is really just amazing. That was the thing I was most interested in talking to him about. That's an absolutely phenomenal thing, that he's getting all this information coming through the rod. And yes, here's another, I guess, good example of our muscle tendon system coming into play. And our skin, as the rod goes down like this, I'm feeling differential pressures on my skin. But what I'm most interested in here is how the rod is acting like a kind of a tool that is kind of extending our touch system. He's able to tell something about the fish that's on the end of the line based on how this kind of tool is conveying information to his touch system. Okay, and we call this proxy touch. Okay, proxy touch is being able to use tools to extend our sense of touch. And so it's basically just touch through a tool. And you've seen this before. We've talked about this. We talked about this when we were discussing John Bramblett, remember? And I actually finally got a paintbrush out. Remember what John needs to do is at first he had to use his left hand to feel the ridges in the paint the puffy paint that he first laid out. But then after a while, he was able to use his brush to feel where those ridges are. And essentially what he's doing is he's using this brush as a proxy touch tool to touch what's on the other end, whether it's the ridges of puffy paint or the paint that he's trying to mix that's on the palette. He's using this as a tool to touch. It's not going to be nearly as messy in this case. He doesn't need to use his fingers. He's using this as a proxy touch tool to feel the consistencies of these paints. And that's not just true of John. It's not just true of Rick. It's true of all of us, when in fact we are doing things like mixing soup with a spoon. So yeah, I did this yesterday actually, or 2 nights ago, I guess. I made some soup for my family, asparagus soup. It was delicious. And I was thinking that this is a great example of a proxy touch situation where I'm using my wooden spoon to tell something about how thick the soup is. Yes, I can look at the soup and tell something about it, but better than that, being able to mix the soup and feeling the resistance of the soup against the wooden spoon allows me to tell something about how thick it is. Just like, feeling the resistance of the paint is telling John Bramblett about the thickness of this paint. And so the spoon in my soup, the wooden spoon in my soup, is telling me something about the consistency of the thing I'm feeling. It's feeling something through a tool, and that gets conveyed through the tool to my touch system. Same thing with having a pen on paper. You might not think of it, but when you're taking notes on a piece of paper, you have to apply just the right amount of pressure, and that information about how much pressure to apply is being conveyed through the pen to your skin. Same thing with eating. When you're cutting things, it's all the same exact situation. So there's John Bramblett again. What I wanted to mention is just one more thing, and then we'll take a little break, and that's that the fish actually has a means of using proxy touch too. And so John and I were talking about this, Rick and I were talking about this, so that the fish will know how to get out. So if the fish doesn't get out by jumping out because you did the right thing and you bowed to the fish, right? What it will typically do, a smart kind of, experienced fish, will be to swim to the boat as fast as it can and then try to get its line tangled up in the weight of the anchor, the line that's in the anchor. So if you're he does sometimes stand as he's standing there in the river and do it, but if you're in a boat, they'll do this a lot, he says, the fish. And what they'll do is they'll swim into the under the boat where the chain is where the anchor is, and get the line tangled up there so that the fisherman has to cut the line. At that point, he can't pull the fish in because the line is tangled up. How does the fish know where the fisherman's boat is? Well, he said what they probably do, Rick's idea, what they probably do is that they feel where the line is tight, and then what they do is they swim in the direction where there's some slack in the line. And as long as they continue to feel that slack, they know they're heading towards the fisherman where the boat is and get them tangled up in the chain. In other words, the fish can use the proxy touch going through the line to know where to swim to get caught in the chain and get released. So that's the fish's proxy touch revenge. They can actually use this. And we do know animals use kind of tools in a proxy touch way. It's kind of a cool way for a fish to do it. Anyway, okay, let's take our little break there. Let's see, what time is it here? Oh, it's 11:22, so we'll come back at 11:32. Great. See you then. Hey everybody, why am I a scary clown? How scary do I look? I look pretty scary. The reason I'm a scary clown is because we're going to shift our discussion now. We're going to leave touch and go right into face perception. And the way I like introducing face perception is through a concept that maybe you heard of, if some of you are kind of avid gamers, called the uncanny valley. What I'm trying to do here is show you that clowns might be scary because they seem a little bit human, but not quite human enough. Are you scared of clowns? Some people are, and that might be part of the reason why. But let's go ahead and start this discussion. And we will, I just need to set this up here, sorry. There we go. All right. You can tell me whether clowns are scary for this reason. But I will stop being a clown so I don't give you nightmares. There I am. Well, that gives you nightmares too, but not the type of nightmares that clowns can give you, at least. All right, here we go. Okay, what is the uncanny valley about? And the way I like to discuss this, and it's discussed in the book, in fact, it's probably the way a lot of people discuss it when they introduce it, is by going through two movies, The Incredibles and The Polar Express. And I think most people have seen both of these movies, it turns out. Actually, this wasn't always the case. The Incredibles is a much more popular movie, and I think, if you agree with me, I don't know, but I think a better movie than The Polar Express. But people know The Polar Express now because it is shown during Christmas time. I'm a little surprised. It's kind of a strange movie, but I guess people like it enough for it to be shown during Christmas. Maybe because Tom Hanks, is part of it or something. I don't know. But most people have not seen these movies. Hopefully you have too. Let me show you some clips from each of these. Not clips, but the images from each of these movies. Oops. On the top, you can see an image of a character from the Polar Express. Remember, the Polar Express is the one where, something to do with Christmas, I don't know. But the Incredibles is the one on the bottom. There's an Incredibles 2, and I think they're both great. They're really fun movies. But I want you to look at both of these images. And when you look at the one on top, especially, it looks a little creepy. If I asked you, first of all, which one looks more like a real person, you say, okay, I guess the one on top does. The one on bottom is intentionally kind of caricaturized. It kind of, elongated, is kind of made to look more like a cartoon. The one on top is supposed to be a little bit more realistic, but boy, is that creepy. There's something weird there, don't you agree? There's something in the eyes. And it's really interesting. When these two movies came out, they actually came out on the same day. And this is one of the reasons they're often compared for their realism. When they came out, the reviews were very different for the two movies. In fact, the Incredibles ended up doing much better than the Polar Express. And the reviews were more positive towards the Incredibles as well. If you go back and look at the reviews for the Polar Express, though, there's something common to all of them. They say that the characters look really, really creepy. The characters look odd. There's something eerie about them. Okay? And that almost every review back then mentioned this sort of thing, regardless of whether or not they liked the plot, they liked the other special effects. They said the characters looked creepy. In fact, a lot more money went into the Polar Express, a lot more money, and a lot more effort and time went into the Polar Express in trying to make the characters real, or as real as they could and still be in an animated movie. But they didn't. It didn't work because they end up looking so scary. I think I have a couple of other images. Yeah, I don't know if you know how this was done, but it was one of the earlier movies where they actually used kind of motion tracking. So you can see there's Tom Hanks, and he's wearing a motion tracking outfit. He's got a cap on that has these little points on it, little kind of little balls that are, I guess, reflective. And he's got a glove on and a suit on that does the same thing. And it makes it easy for a computer to kind of capture the motion of an actor performing a scene and then use it to animate. And they did this pretty much for the entire movie. It just wasn't Tom Hanks. They did for the other characters, like this little boy here. And, a lot of effort. And the money went into trying to make this look as real as possible. But in so doing, they clearly didn't do it well enough. Where the Incredibles, on the other hand, they didn't really care if the characters looked real. They didn't want them to look real. They wanted them to look expressive. They wanted the story to be told in an emotional way. But they knew that, decades of animation would allow that, and you didn't need to do motion capture for that purpose. They didn't really care. And in fact, they made a conscious effort not to make the characters look as real as possible. I think I have a few more images of this. Yeah, there you go. These are all Polar Express images. This one's not terrible. It isn't as scary, but man, this guy's going to haunt your dreams. What is it? I mean, when you look at these images, what is it about these images that make them so eerie? And on my first pass, I would say the eyes. I don't know if you agree. It looks like as I first look at this, it's the eyes that kind of jump out and make it seem like they're zombies or something, or like they're possessed. They just don't look real. And look at here, these eyes are no more real. If anything, they're less real than these eyes. But these don't look eerie. These don't look creepy. So what is going on here? And here's the idea of the uncanny valley. And this is going to take a couple seconds to explain, but I think you already have intuitions about what's going on. But I think this will help kind of maybe make it a little bit more formal, a little bit more firm in understanding what's going on. And what this graph is showing here and is just for, I guess what we'll call here is familiarity, or how comfortable or how appealing the image seems. And here it will be how much is the image or the animation human-like. Okay. And what it's showing, let's go with this still image, since this is what we've been talking about. So, well, actually, let's go with the dotted line, because that's the example I give in the book. So if I ask you, which of the robots, C-3PO or R2-D2, do you kind of, I don't know, feel have more in common with, or would want to sit down with, or something like that? They're both robots, and certainly I don't want to take anything away from how cute R2-D2 is, or it's the little one that has the ball and everything. I know they're adorable little robots, but you probably say that, yeah, C-3PO is more familiar. It's more human-like. And it's not scary. I think C-3PO is kind of charming too. A neurotic robot that's pretty charming. Say, cool. Okay, let's make C-3PO a little bit more endearing. Let's now put a dress on him. Okay, that'd be fun. Kind of a casual dress. Say, oh, C-3PO is wearing a dress. Isn't that cool? Good for him. No problem with that, and it's kind of endearing. Okay, cool. Now, so what we're doing here is we're going up here. So he's almost, C-3PO is starting over here, and he's becoming a little bit more human by putting a dress on him. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take C-3PO and we're going to put a wig on him. A nice curly-haired wig, like from the 50s. So he's going to wear a 50s dress and a 50s wig, like the mobs would wear in the 50s. Say, oh, C-3PO, you look charming. Can you cook? Whatever. And as we kind of continue to go up here and make him more real with the wig, we say, yes, he's more familiar. He completely is charming. We can identify with him. We can interact with him. That makes perfect sense. And now we're going to do one more thing to C-3PO. We're going to put a rubber mask on him. We're going to put a mask of, I don't know, anybody. Put it on his face. And, he goes in and puts on the mask. He still has his wig on. He still has his dress on. He comes back in, and he's got this mask on. And what's going to happen? I think, at least if you're like me, when someone or a robot would wear a rubber mask, they start looking a little creepy. I mean, that's kind of what Halloween's about. These rubber masks, yeah, they can be scary looking, but even if it's of, somebody like the president, I won't go into the creepiness of that, but, a famous person's rubber mask or something like that, it does look a little creepier. And on C-3PO, all of a sudden, it's going to look really creepy. So, oops. Sorry. Yeah, here we go. all of a sudden, what went from a kind of feeling of familiarity, when C3PO puts on the rubber mask, it's going to drop. All of a sudden, it's like, whoa, that is creepy. It's almost, all of a sudden, he kind of looks like almost like a corpse or a zombie with that rubber mask on. He looks scary. A prosthetic hand, it says here, but don't worry about that. It's like he has a prosthetic face on all of a sudden, right? If it's a great mask and he looks just like a person now, that could raise it back up, but very few masks will do that, right? That rubber mask won't. And so what happens as a robot, as an image on animation, a video game character gets more and more real, you're comfortable until you notice something that's not real about them, whether it's in the eyes, whether it's the rubber mask, and it dips down into this valley here on the familiarity graph, on the comfortability or appeal graph, where they seem uncanny. What I mean by uncanny, they don't seem quite real. They don't seem quite real, and all of a sudden it gets creepy. Okay, so it's a range then. The uncanny valley is a range in which realism, that may be part of what you're seeing, that they look kind of real, but that realism then makes anything that's not realistic look like, I don't know, well, uncanny, of course, is the word, but surreal almost. Like it's not, it looks like it's just kind of like alien to us. It makes it look uncanny. So that's what's meant by the uncanny valley. The more you make something look real, okay, the more it seems that our brain is getting very kind of choosy, picky about everything else looking real. And if it doesn't, it flips into this valley where all of a sudden you say, that is creepy. That is weird, zombie-like. That is really, really scary. Okay? And that's the uncanny valley. Interestingly, we get the uncanny valley pretty much just with, I'm sorry, I got one more thing here to show you. Yeah, this is just another example of it. And this is something that's been discussed even before we were doing animation and film and video games. They talk about this with regard to robots, that, it's okay to, an industrial robot that doesn't look anything like a human is fine. You're not going to identify with it. I saw a new robot that came out the other day that's like $10,000. It's basically just a pole that's a vertical pole, and it has a horizontal pole with something flexible on the end, and it can rotate back and forth and go up and down. And even though it's so simple, and it also rolls around the room. Even though it's so simple, it can do a number of amazing things. It can grab things, it can move things, it can help you lift things, all this sort of stuff. And there's no way that you would ever think that it's human-like in any sense. It doesn't, it's clearly a machine, but it can be programmed to, kind of be autonomous and do a lot of things on its own. But, you've seen other robots that are, kind of more human-like, like these kind of cute little ones down here. It's kind of hard to see, I apologize. And we're fine with those. We think they're cute. They're like C3PO robots. But then you start putting faces on robots, and you can see pretty quickly robots can get scary and scarier and scarier. They have to look real. I mean, I guess maybe the examples you folks would know if you watch Westworld, those are robots that look, very real, and they've kind of gone past the uncanny point, right? When they have their faces on. When they don't have their faces on, they're a little creepy, of course. But that's the idea, that once they start looking real, our brains get really picky. We start picking things out. And it is true that it is specific, it seems, to human forms. So this has been a problem in computer games, movies, just computer-generated images that did not move for a long, long time. And what was realized pretty early on was this really was something specific for animating humans. So in the original, video games, if you had animals, that didn't look quite real enough, it really wouldn't bother people that much. But once you put a human on the screen and you were trying to make them look as real as possible, they would start looking creepy. So I remember the first Tiger Woods golf game I remember seeing, and it did look, you could say that's Tiger Woods, but man, they did not get the eyes right, and it looked really creepy. And of course, action games can be very much like that. I was looking at one of my kids' games. God, I can't remember it's a new game that's it's a, you know, kind of apocalypse game, and there are zombies or something. It just came out. It's very popular. And it looks, I mean, the characters look great. They really, really do. But, you know, if you sit there with them a little while and look at them, there's still something uncanny, and it typically involves the eyes. If you're animating gorillas, though, like in King Kong, if you've seen any of the King Kong films or any other, you know, films that have animated dogs or cats or anything like that, yeah, you might be able to tell they're animated or suspect they're animated, but they don't have the same sort of effect, kind of almost visceral effect of us finding them weird. And it's not just the human forms. I think it's, so yes, it will be if you see a character walking and they walk in a way that seems computer animated, you will be very aware of that. But more than that, it seems to be especially conspicuous with faces. And that's what we're going to end up talking about today, is that our brains seem so sensitive to faces. And any deviation from a natural-looking face that's not intentionally caricaturized, as you see here with the Polar Express, okay, you become very aware of it. Okay, you become very, very aware of it. You know, there's different aspects to this. There's different aspects to this uncanny valley thing. So it's one thing to make them, you know, it doesn't seem real enough. So you can say this guy doesn't seem real. But what is it about having that kind of visceral, icky reaction, like, oh wow, that looks eerie, that looks scary, that looks zombie-like, it's going to haunt my nightmares? What's that about? And really, it's the speculation on that, but it has to do with that maybe we are kind of evolved to see things like that as maybe repulsive, even because we have adapted to avoid corpses. It turns out that corpses are going to sometimes, especially in the older days, be disease ridden. And we are, in fact, we're repulsed by corpses in the sense that we know to stay away from them. We don't want to touch them, loved ones aside, of course, but for the most part, corpses are things that we stay away from. And what might be going with the uncanny valley is they are in some way, because they seem almost undead sort of images that are kind of repulsion from uncanny valley sorts of faces is kind of related to our repulsion from corpses. So that's one kind of theory about why we're repulsed by uncanny valley images. But that's really more of an aside. What I'm most interested in here is how this really kind of conveys that we are extraordinarily sensitive to faces. That we are sensitive to any deviation in a face if it's supposed to look real. And in some ways, the more real it looks, the more sensitive we are to mistakes or parts of the face that aren't real enough. Here, we don't care because it's not supposed to be a real face. It's a caricatured face. It's a cartoon face. Yeah, the eyes aren't perfect, but who cares? It's not a real face. Here, the face is getting pretty close to looking pretty real. And boy, are we aware of the eyes. That's the idea. So let me tell you a little story about this chapter as I was writing it. This was really exciting for me because, first of all, I love faces. We do some face research in our laboratory, so I was really looking forward to writing this anyway. I knew about the uncanny valley, and I knew about this was a really great way to get people into understanding how sensitive we are to faces. But as I was finishing up this chapter, in this section of the chapter, something fascinating happened in the field of computer animation. And it is this. It's the curious case of Benjamin Button. I don't know if you know this. This came out in 2009, 2010, maybe? 2008, 2009, 2010. I can't remember right now. But I don't know if you've seen this. It's a nice movie. If you have a chance to see it, it's kind of a kind of allegory sort of movie. Brad Pitt's in it. And it's nicely acted and nicely put together. It is fun. Moving. It's about a character who actually ages in reverse. So he starts off looking very old, and as time goes on, he looks younger and younger. And what they needed to do in order to convey that in the movie is they basically needed to create an animated Brad Pitt. Okay. They needed to do computer animation, and they needed to do it especially with a face. And so they were really kind of tasked with something that was very intimidating. And I interviewed one of the main animators of the company, Steve Prieg. The company's called Digital Domain, and there's Steve there. And as you can see, Steve won, and his colleagues won multiple Oscars for the special effects in this movie. It was a wonderful interview because I actually had set up the interview like a month before without really kind of making the connection that they were up for the Academy Award. And the week I was there on like Tuesday or Wednesday. They had just won the Academy Award on Sunday, and man, the whole place was flying. It was like floating on air, these folks. They were so happy. And what they won for was, I think, a general agreement in the public and in the professional domain that they had figured out a way of animating a convincing face, a convincing animated face that did not have uncanny valley problems. They made a Brad Pitt animated face that you see through the first half of the movie. People don't realize this. If you see the movie, you'll now remember what I'm telling you. When you see Brad Pitt, you're thinking, oh, what they probably did is superimposed Brad Pitt's face on somebody else's body or something like that. No. The entire first half of the movie was an animated Brad Pitt. You don't see the real Brad Pitt until an hour into the 2-hour movie. And what I have here is a little kind of demonstration clip that they sent out to the Academy members so that the Academy members could understand the sort of work that went into it. And you'll get a sense of how this was done. And hopefully it will at least sound good, if not look good in terms of how smooth it is.
What if I told you that I wasn't getting older, I was getting younger than everybody else? Oh, 7, but I look a lot older. God bless you. Rise! Say hallelujah. Now when I look back on it, it was miraculous. What if I told you that I wasn't getting older, I was getting younger than everybody else?
Angel, what I say, you are looking strikingly different.
You're gonna have a baby soon. That's what my mom was saying.
I'm not as old as I look.
Think so?
Well, I heard Mom and Disney whisper they said I was gonna die soon, but maybe not.
Man,
Come here.
you're different than anybody I've ever met.
there were many changes. Some you could see, some you couldn't. Hair started growing in all sorts of places, along with other things. I felt pretty good, considering.
You've been on this earth however many years, and you've never had a woman. Oh, this is the saddest thing I've ever heard in my life. Thank you.
No, thank you. Have a nice night.
Will you be here too?
Maybe next Sunday.
Maybe good, but your hands. Is that painful? I was born with some form of disease. What kind of disease? I was born old. I'm sorry. No need to be. There's nothing wrong with old age. I enjoyed talking to you. I enjoyed drinking with you.
Would you mind if time to time I stop by and say hello?
Anytime. Good night, Mr. Rod.
Good night, Mitch.
I don't know how it's possible, but you seem to have more height on.
What if I told you that I wasn't getting older, I was getting younger than everybody else?
Well, I feel sorry for you. You have to see everybody you love die before you do. It's an awful responsibility.
I never thought about life or death that way before.
So let me just point out a couple of things of that video. First of all, you saw at one point they show Brad Pitt with all this makeup, all this kind of speckled makeup on it. What they are doing there when he had his speckled makeup on is actually doing some kind of capturing of his motions as he went into different sorts of facial expressions. So he smiles, he frowns, he lifts kind of an eyebrow, he kind of looks concerned, all that sort of stuff. Those are the motions they actually captured. When they show him later on kind of performing some of the scenes when he doesn't have the makeup on, that is not captured at all. They just use that for a reference. Because what they really ended up doing was creating a Brad Pitt puppet. This is what Steve Pre called it, a Brad Pitt face puppet. That they captured his various expressions and going from one expression to another, and then kind of from those expressions built a computer animated face that they then could control. They also controlled it to make it look like it was talking. And they used the video they did take of Brad Pitt going through the dialogue and stuff like that, just as reference. They'd have it next to them on the computer, next to their computer screen as they was doing this. But they were really animating from scratch, not motion capture, like they did with Tom Hanks. They were animating all these expressions based on what they had taken and then, kind of creating them from scratch. So they really did. I think they talked to other folks that do computer animation after the Academy Awards. They came up to Steve Pre. They said, "I can't believe that the first half of the movie wasn't Brad Pitt's face superimposed." They said, "No, that's the animation," and I guess they really did traverse the uncanny valley. Now I should mention, it was interesting. And I bet some of you are aware of this sort of issue, that even though they did, I guess, do a compelling, convincing job of creating an animated face that wasn't spooky in this movie, movies since then have not always been successful at that. In fact, when I was talking to Steve, he said that, we're doing a new movie, I can't tell you about it, but we're going to try to do something very similar with Jeff Bridges' face. We're going to have, the older Jeff Bridges, as he is now, actually having conversations with a young Jeff Bridges that we're going to computer animate from scratch, just like we did with Brad Pitt. And I didn't know at the time when he told me this, but it ended up being Tron, the newer of the Tron movies. There was one when I was a kid, but maybe you've seen the newer Tron movies with Jeff Bridges. And they do have a young Jeff Bridges animated in that. But, I have to be honest, even though I think Steve Brieg and his company are just terrific, I thought it would look kind of creepy, that young Jeff Bridges. And there's been other movies, the Star Wars movies. I mean, you know that Carrie Fisher was animated, and other characters have been animated, and they're more or less successful with that. It is such a difficult thing to do, even though they were able to do it once. And I talked to Steve for a long time about why it was so hard. He said that, as I've been kind of suggesting, yes, we are so sensitive to faces, and any deviation that occurs is a problem. And he said a lot of what they ended up doing as they were creating Brad Pitt's animated face for Benjamin Button is that they would get like a good part of the skin looking good. They got the skin looking right, and they would show it to people. Very often they'd have the staff come in, people working in the front office, people who weren't actually doing the animation come in with fresh eyes and say, oh yeah, the skin looks good, but now the eyes look weird, or the motion looks weird. So then they fix the motion of the movements of his head, and they say, yeah, the motion looks good and the skin looks good, but now the eyes seem strange. And it was kind of this thing, he said, that the more they got each component looking right, the more another aspect of it looked wrong. And I think it's such an interesting thing that our brain is doing. It's like, yeah, it's convinced that it's it's on its way to looking better, but as it does so, we become even more aware of problems, of deviations in the face. He said there's kind of this all or none principle of the uncanny valley. And in fact, his intuitions are absolutely right. The research on the uncanny valley show the exact same thing. You need to get things absolutely right all across, or you don't, you have problems. Correcting one thing leads the observer to find something else that's wrong. And he gave me this amazing example that they were just having such trouble with his eyes, with Brad Pitt's eyes. They felt they had gotten the motion and the skin and the movement right, and everyone was saying the eyes just don't look right. So what they ended up doing is taking close-up videos of Steve's eyes, real videos of his eyes moving around. And then he showed me, they projected it on the screen, close-up of his eyes, projected on a screen that was like a 2-story high screen. Like, the sort of thing you would see like in a big old movie theater. So here's this image of his eye, like taking up 2 stories, and the eye's just basically moving back and forth. It's looking at things, one eye just looking back and forth. And they spent a lot of time just kind of trying to figure out what it is about a real eye that makes it look real. And what they realized was that when your eye moves to one side, it kind of pushes the moisture on your eye. You have moisture on your eye to help kind of lubricate its movements. When your eye moves to the left, the moisture kind of collects on that side of the eye. So there's more moisture on the left side of the eye when it looks left. When it then looks right, there's more moisture on the right side of the eye than the left side of the eye. And that moisture kind of cue turned out to be really important. And then they put that into the animation so that whenever the Brad Pitt face puppet moved its eyes back and forth, it in fact had that little cue in there for realism. And they said that made a huge difference. And then we really felt like we are on our way to really solving this problem. Okay, let me take a little break there, see if you guys have questions. I bet you guys know lots of examples of Uncanny Valley, if you want to share any of those, or anything else, any questions about how this works. I know there's been other movies recently that have this problem. Some of them are conspicuously bad. I remember they did the animation of the late actress that played the grandma on, or the mother on Sopranos, Tony's mother on The Sopranos. They animated her, and it was just, people were really upset. It was such a bad job. It can be done really bad, and it can look really, really strange. Any questions, any comments on this? Any experience with this type of thing? No? Okay, that's all right. That's all right. Let's go ahead and do a polling question. We'll do an Uncanny Valley one. Let's see. Should be easy. The Uncanny Valley phenomenon is most likely to occur with human forms. Yep, or most likely to occur with faces, or might be related to our natural tendency to avoid corpses, or all of the above. What I want to do. Okay, give me a few more seconds here. Doing good. Got 4 responses out of 7. Anyone else want to respond just for fun? All right, that's fine. Let's end the poll, and I will share it. Oh, look at this. It's not showing the entire answer for 3. I don't know if you're not seeing that, but I'm not. If the answer might be related to our natural tendency to avoid corpses. Sorry about that, but most of you got it right. It is most likely to occur with human forms, and that is, to some degree, human bodies. Walking, we are very sensitive to an animated person walking. If it doesn't look right, we're sensitive to that. But especially, we are sensitive to faces, human faces, most specifically. And finally, it might be related to our natural tendency to avoid corpses. So the correct answer is, in fact, D, all of the above. Okay, cool. Hey, I thought I'd play with this just a tiny bit. What do you think of this? Creepy? That's kind of a nice uncanny valley. So if you can't do an uncanny valley using snap camera, what can you do? Good. Let's got a couple more in here. That's a little creepy. That's not too creepy. Not this one. Oh, that's great. Ah, silly. How about this? Okay, we'll take that off. I just thought, if we can't use snap camera for that, what can we use it for? Okay, any other questions? Were you scared? Scared? Okay. Sorry if I scared you. Sorry if I made you repulsed by my corpse-like appearance. Let's just finish this up very quickly with Steve Prieg. And again, what should be obvious here is that this has to do with us being face perception experts, really. In other words, what we are really experts with faces. We are ultra sensitive for faces. It is one of our clear kind of special powers and how well we can pick out even minor deviations in faces. Okay, why is that the case? What is it about faces that make them so important? Well, there's lots of ideas on this, but I think one of them we can certainly agree on is that faces are in some ways the most efficient communicators that we ever encounter. Yes, so we're thinking about the internet. There's so many ways to kind of convey information so quickly so in such distances on the internet, and quickly to some degree too. But think about faces. When we look at a face, think about all the information we get from it. So clearly we get identity, right? We know right away who somebody is if we are familiar with their face. We get something called intent. And what I mean by intent is just by looking at somebody's face, we can tell what their emotional state is, and therefore, as it pertains to us, what their intent might be towards us, whether it's anger, whether it's empathy, whether it's attraction, love, that sort of thing. We do know something almost immediately when we look at a person's facial expression. Fitness, and what I mean by this is just whether somebody is going to be a fit person to have healthy offspring with, and we'll talk about that Serena will be talking about that on Monday. I think you'll find that really interesting. But when we talk about attractiveness, that's probably what we're talking about. We're talking about how a face is advertising the fitness for mate selection and offspring. And then we will talk about in a separate set of lectures, we'll talk about language and lip reading, and that's something as I think I do in my lab. But all of this information can come from a face, and it can come from a face so quickly probably there are no other ways to communicate so much information so quickly. We just don't think of it that way because we're so used to, encountering them all the time. But it is such an important part of our perceptual repertoire, right? It really does. And it's so important, as you'll see, that if we aren't able to get this through seeing faces, we will get it through hearing voices. So much of this also comes through voices, but with faces, man, if our vision's intact, this information gets right in there and kind of makes contact with very, very important parts of the brain. And it is evolutionarily important for us to be sensitive to this sort of information. And we are really, as I said, hypersensitive to faces. And this is what the uncanny valley is really all about. This research shows that we're very aware of very subtle changes in faces. If it's a face you've looked at for a very long time, so this is Mao Zedong's face that at least used to be, I don't know if it still is, but used to be all over China, on billboards and that sort of thing. And they would typically use the exact same image, or it would be the most prominent image would be this one. I have a difficult time telling these images apart, but there are very subtle differences in the distance between the eyes in these two images. And if in fact you are used to seeing that face, you can tell the differences with barely any sort of change between them. So people who are practiced with a particular face can tell when there's any deviation whatsoever. It's kind of like the uncanny valley, but now in this case, it's a real face. It's a photograph of a face, but it's a very, very subtle change. People who have experience have that type of sensitivity to it. The other thing is, it's like our brain is almost, kind of primed to see faces whenever it can. And there's lots of examples of this. You look on the internet and you see websites dedicated to faces that are in trees and faces that are in rocks. And of course, faces that might be in toasted cheese sandwiches or in crackers or something like that are considered to have some sort of divine, kind of reason or something like that. It is as if the brain wants to see faces wherever it can, like in electrical outlets, in the front of cars. And it's interesting. We can all see a face if we look at the front of a car in that way. But you might not know that car designers actually consider the fact that the fronts of cars look like faces and that people's brains cannot help but interpret the front of cars like faces. So they concentrate very hard on how they want that face to convey something about the feel of the car or the type of customer they want to appeal to. With something like this Miata here as an example, they wanted to appeal to kind of young people as a fun car, so they make it kind of look like a cute kind of cartoony sort of front to a face, and it works. That's how we can see it. That's a friendly, fun car, I would say, based on its little smile and its eyes. So yeah, it can be very effective, and they know this. People who design cars know that. Yeah, you can't help it. You see fronts of cars like faces, and that's something that you're going to, whether you're aware of it or not, incorporate into how you, evaluate the appeal of the look of the car. It happens so quickly too. It happens so quickly, and this is one of the most interesting things I think about this face literature is that we analyze faces faster than we actually are consciously aware of seeing a face. And so, if you show a face for 1/50th of a second, okay, it is going to be too quickly for your conscious awareness to know that you're looking at a face. In fact, if you put people in front of a computer screen, show them a face for 1/50th of a second, they might say something like, I saw a flash on the screen, but nothing else. And they'll say, well, did you see a face in that flash? They'll say, no, I didn't see anything having to do with a face. I maybe saw a flash, but that's it. And a lot of people won't even see a flash on the screen. But you'll find out that, in fact, face information actually gets in despite it being below our conscious awareness. I got to do something just very quickly. Let me just text my kids so they close the door. Because my dog's going to go attack my gardener otherwise, and that would be bad. Funny I have to do this now, but that's what happened. Okay. You met Max. He doesn't look ferocious, but guess what? He can eat. He'll just go out and bark at him, that's all. I just don't want that to happen to the poor guy. All right, anyway. So anyway, yeah, faces. The fact that they can be recognized in such a brief period of time without conscious awareness is just, I think, so interesting. And it really is. A lot of this really is kind of specific to faces, as we'll learn. And one of the first experiments to show this is kind of an interesting one. It's a little complicated to explain, especially with the gardener behind me, but I will try my best. People sat in front of a computer screen and were asked to press a button as they saw faces about whether that person was famous or not. And guess what? They sat in front of the screen, and the faces were shown so quickly to them, they never consciously saw a face. At first they kind of presented a couple of faces slowly and said, okay, this is a famous person, and maybe they showed Brad Pitt. Here's a person that's not famous, Rosenblum. Just push a button, yes, if it's famous, push a button, no, if it's not famous. And then they say, okay, that sounds like so easy. And then they're told, but here's the trick, it's going to come so quickly, you might not actually ever be aware of seeing a face, so you're going to have to do a lot of guessing. Say, all right, and that's exactly what happens. The faces come up so quickly, they don't consciously see them. They look like flashes on the screen. They look like the screen gets bright for a second. For some people, they don't even see that. And so they have to guess. I don't know. I don't know if that's famous. I don't know if that's famous. They say, just make your best guess. And people think they are absolutely random, okay, at making a famous versus a not famous sort of judgment. But here's the interesting thing. Some of the famous faces they're shown, this is an older study, as you'll see, some of the famous faces that are shown are of kind of famous people that have a positive kind of connotation or a positive association. So that's Mick Jagger there. Yeah, okay. Yeah, people like Mick Jagger. He's a terrific entertainer. Probably an okay guy. I would say that's a positive famous face. And there's an infamous face, Saddam Hussein, and he obviously has negative connotations, associations. And so both of those groups, famous and infamous, meaning that they were known for being very negatively associated people. Those were part of the famous set. And so then they looked to see how good people were at first doing the famous versus infamous thing. And as it turns out, they weren't great at it. They really couldn't tell whether the faces were famous or infamous. But you then look at the famous faces on their own. Okay, you look at the famous faces on their own, and you see that whether they responded that the face was famous or not famous depended on whether that famous face was positive like Mick Jagger or negative like Saddam Hussein. And people would say that the negative famous faces were not famous, or the positive famous faces were famous. Again, even though they never consciously saw the face. Okay, so they weren't good at famous versus not famous. What they were good at was the ones that induced the emotional reaction. And they said those positive famous faces were, yes, famous, but those negative famous faces were not famous. Okay, and they then made sure that people knew who those infamous faces, those negative faces were, and everybody did. It's not like they didn't recognize the infamous faces. It's just that they didn't want to categorize them as famous. So this very quick subliminal below consciousness sort of image of the face goes right to the emotional center, and that's what it seems to be affecting. There's other examples. We'll come to a whole bunch of other examples of how subliminally presented faces are actually processed, but I think you'll find this next one very interesting. You've probably heard of this before. Prosopagnosia. Maybe you haven't heard of it from that title before, but what prosopagnosia is a brain injury related problem in recognizing faces. So maybe you've heard of people who've had strokes And after waking up from this, a coma or whatever, and have had a stroke in their brain, and everything seems spared. Their language is fine. They can speak. They can understand. They can recognize foods and use utensils. Their motor skills are fine, but for some reason they can't recognize faces. There was a book years ago called "The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat," by Oliver Sacks, and that was about this issue where sometimes brain injuries lead to people not being able to recognize faces, and they're called prosopagnostics. And it's interesting, when you see that somebody has this problem, and typically what they'll be in a hospital room and they'll ask the doctors initially to reintroduce themselves, because they'll say, "Oh, I haven't met you before," even though they have met them, because they now don't recognize their face. And then their family members come in and they won't recognize them right off the bat until they start talking, and they'll recognize the voices, and then they'll realize, they can't recognize even family members or even their own face, especially from a picture. They can't do this. I actually had a person who was in the class, perception class many years ago, who was prosopagnostics, and she had come up with a lot of different ways of compensating for that problem. But here's the interesting thing about prosopagnosia. We didn't know this until about 10 years ago. We've known about prosopagnosia for a very long time ago. And we also knew prosopagnostics had an injury in a particular area of their brain. We always thought that area had to do with face recognition. But about 10 years ago, people started doing different types of experiments with prosopagnostics. And they took different measures. Rather than just asking them, is this a face you recognize or not, what they would say, and people would say, I can't recognize any faces. They would show famous or recognizable faces and non-recognizable faces, maybe famous faces and non-famous faces, and ask if they knew who these people were. They say, I have no idea. I can tell you that's an image of a guy, possibly Mick Jagger, with kind of bangs and longer hair in the back, and he's smiling, but I have no idea who that is. But they also did another measure. Rather than just asking them who that was, they took measures of sweat. Okay, they actually used one of these kind of galvanic skin response sort of tools that take sweat or moisture measures from the skin. And what they found is, though, even though when they were looking at a famous face, they consciously had no idea who that person was, whenever they saw a famous versus a not famous face, their skin did sweat a little bit more. So their sweat response seemed to suggest that on some level they knew they were looking at a famous face. Okay? So again, and it also occurred with not just famous faces, it occurred with family members. So you saw, people were showing pictures of their family members, and they would say, I don't know who that is. It's a woman. I would say it's a youngish woman. But I don't know, and then other pictures would come up. But if they're showing a picture of their daughter, even though they're saying they don't know who that is, they will show more sweat response than if they are shown a stranger. So on some level, some sort of face processing is going on, even though they're not consciously aware of recognizing the face, at least. And the same thing's also been shown with a very simple experiment. You don't need to buy yourself a galvanic skin response sweat detecting tool if you don't want to. You can just show people pictures of faces with names underneath and ask people to just read the name as quickly as possible. So you see the image of Mick Jagger, and underneath Mick Jagger you see the name Mick Jagger written here. And you're told, as a subject, you tell people subjects are told to look at the face, but as quickly as possible, read the name underneath, and we're going to time how quickly you can read those names. Okay? And if the name Mick Jagger comes under a picture of Mick Jagger, people are faster at saying the name Mick Jagger than if the name Mick Jagger comes under a picture of Saddam Hussein. They are slower at saying Mick Jagger. So these sorts of, Julia Roberts is the other example. If Julia Roberts' name is under a picture of Julia Roberts, you'll say Julia Roberts faster than if Julia Roberts' name is under, say, Sandra Bullock's face. Yeah, even that, those are two women that are roughly the same age. But the prosopagnogic, the person who then says, I have no idea who that face is being influenced, at least subliminally, under the awareness, by that identity of the face. So we're starting to think prosopagnosia is a much more complicated sort of problem than we used to think. It's not a problem of recognizing faces. You don't have a face perception issue, perhaps. You have a problem consciously being aware of recognizing a face and knowing consciously who that face is. So even on that level, we're talking about a sensitivity to faces that we didn't realize before. Okay, let's take a little break here. See, oh, it looks like there's some questions. They might be from earlier. Right. Oh, Ralph says that he wasn't scared by my face. Great. He grew up on horror, even horror worse than my own face, I guess. Aya says, I know instances where people see the face of Jesus in their food. Yes, and I think that, you know, for whatever reason, that does occur. But the fact that very often it's the face of these, you know, divine entities, you know, whether it's Jesus or Mother Mary or something like that, probably the face perception aspects of our brains allow us to kind of make out those faces readily. For whatever, you know, whether you think these are real or not, the face perception part of our brains allow us to see these things because they are so sensitive to faces that we can see faces in so many different types of images. Other questions now about prosopagnosia or kind of unconscious face perception. We'll continue talking about that, but I wanted to see if there's anything at this point. I think faces are so cool. I always have. I don't know if you're good at recognizing faces. I'm much better at remembering faces than I am names. I mean, I'm one of these guys. You know, I live in Los Angeles, and you know, I used to do a lot of my writing, paper writing, book writing in coffee shops, and you know, you see famous people. And very often the famous people are disguised a little bit, you know, or, you know, they're wearing sunglasses and a hat or something like that. But out of anybody, all my friends who would be there at the coffee shop writing their own things with me, I would always recognize a famous person sooner than anybody else. And that's also the case at restaurants when I'm out with, you know, when I'm out with my wife or my friends or whatever. I have got this face that just kind of recognizes people so easily. And as it turns out, there are differences in how well we recognize faces. I guess I'm on the end where I do a good job. I'm terrible about, as good as I am with faces, I'm that bad with names. But I'm really good with faces. And there is a range. We used to think that, you know, there's either, you know, normal kind of face recognition sort of abilities or less normal. But there is a degree to which I guess people can be born with something like prosopagnosia. Now, all that being said, yes, there can be individual differences in picking out famous people from a face. That doesn't mean that we're not all able to recognize facial expressions and age and all these very subtle things really well. So our recognition, you know, abilities can be different a little bit. Okay, I'm really good, but everybody, even to some degree of prosopagnosia, is really, really good at picking out expression and age-related things, and as we'll see, language-related things. So it's interesting. Have you ever had an experience where you found yourself, you know, good or less good at recognizing faces? I'm just curious. No? Okay. All right, you don't have to respond now. No problem. We'll go to our polling question. All right, let's see. Uncanny Valley. You know something? Yeah, I can't ask this because we didn't go through it yet. So, well, we did that already. Oh my gosh. You know, did we do the question here? Please, somebody tell me, did we do a question on the tongue display unit? I don't think we did. Can you look back really quickly? I can give you this one. See, unfortunately, the Zoom polling feature does not allow me to know which questions I've asked and which I don't. Anybody? Did we go through the tongue display unit question? No. Here you go, guys. Thank you, Ralph. I appreciate that. So having patterned electrode activity in your tongue, on your tongue, with the tongue display unit, A, allows you to perceive lines and curves of various orientations. B, allows you to experience perceived objects outside the body instead of the tongue after some practice. C, induces activity in visual brain regions after some practice. Or D, all of the above. Should be easy for you if you remember back to this lecture. Good. All right, about another 10 seconds here. Most of you are getting this right. Okay. So the correct answer is D. Are you seeing that? I'm not on my screen. It looks like part of the image was cut off for some strange reason. But 3 of you chose D, which is correct. 1 of you chose A. Sorry, I don't know why it's not looking good today, but there's the question anyway. So having pattern electroactivity on your tongue with the tongue display unit allows you to perceive lines and curves of various orientations. And if nothing else, you remember the video of that person being able to do that. And it's something that you can do actually fairly quickly with trying it. It does take a little practice, but not much practice. But then with more practice, you start to experience some pretty cool things, including starting to perceive objects outside of the tongue. So it seems like things are actually in front of you. You know, you're experiencing things as if you were actually seeing them, that they exist out in the world, not just tongue tickles. And I think, this answer B, I think I'm going to just change a tiny bit. It allows you to experience perceived objects outside the body instead of just on the tongue, is probably what I should say. Because you still do actually perceive tickles on your tongue if you try to concentrate on that. But after you've had a lot of practice, the most important thing is you're perceiving things like, shapes outside of you, in front of you at a certain distance. They seem like they are real objects outside of you, not just tickles on the tongue. So you do get the tickles still, but importantly, you do perceive things outside. And once that occurs, as you know, there's this really cool correlation that when you start perceiving things out in the world, that's when your visual brain becomes part of the process, and that's that absolutely happens with some practice. So the answer is D, all of the above. Oh, I didn't share the results. I'm really sorry. There you go. Yeah, okay, so go ahead and take a picture. The actual correct answer is D. Again, it's not showing that line there. I apologize. But there you go. Take a picture. The correct answer is D. Okay, cool. Any other questions? All right. Then let's... Oh, sorry about this. Okay, so all these things came up, yeah. I don't see the poll. Does anyone else see it? I'm sorry, I forgot to show the poll at the end. I don't know what's going on. I guess what I'll do before next class is I will restart Zoom and see if that kind of cleans things up. I apologize for that. It was certainly my fault that I didn't show the results at the end. Okay, but you got me talking about it, and you can go back to the movie if you need me to say it out loud or whatever. But there you go. You should have that. Okay. Huh. All right. So let's continue talking about this. And we're going to see other examples about kind of like this a subliminal sort of perception or processing of faces. And again, these are just examples where we are not consciously aware of seeing a face. but it still affects how we respond, which is really interesting. And I think it does, again, speak to the kind of the impressive, sophisticated processing and efficiency of the processing of human faces that we have. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about facial expression as examples of this. But a couple of things I wanted to say about facial expression before we get into the subliminal nature of it. And that is, you may have learned about facial expression perception in other classes, and sometimes, I don't know if they still teach this, but they used to teach it that expressions were the same all over the world. I don't know if they still do. Sometimes intro classes teach that. Maybe you learned it in high school, that you show these 7 expressions to people all over the world, and they'll tell you that they are, let's take a look and see if I can do this. Happiness, that's a smile. Surprise, disgust, I don't remember what that is. Cynicism, something like that. Anger, scared, fearful, and sad. Okay, I can't remember what that one is. All right, anyway. But people will be fairly consistent across cultures. As it turns out, that's probably not completely true. There is some cultural universality, and I will talk about that in just a second. But what clearly happens is, and you probably know this, probably, almost better in Southern California than almost any other place in the country, we encounter so many different cultures. This is a wonderful part about being in Southern California. So many different cultures, so many, first-generation individuals, second-generation individuals here, and we know people have different cultures. And you may have noticed this, whether in Southern California or when you've traveled, that different people from different cultures have different ways of kind of expressing emotion to some degree. The example I like to give was when I was traveling in England many years ago. I remember being in London and being on the tube and, kind of smiling at people or watching them interact so I could see them smile back. And the smiles would be kind of very contained, right? Think about the Queen, think about the royal family in general. If they smile, it's kind of a very subtle sort of smile. I was really struck by this when, during the wedding of Meghan and what's his name, right? The American, Canadian, whatever, woman that is now back in America, that her smile seems so much more, striking than the smile of the royal family. And this is something I noticed when I was in London, that the smiles in London, at least, were more kind of contained. And then I did some traveling outside London into rural England and into Scotland. And boy, the expressions were really wide. They were really very, not exaggerated, but, they were just amplified relative to the expressions I was seeing in London. And this actually happens sometimes in cities. People's expressions in cities are sometimes a little bit more constrained than they are out in rural areas for whatever reason. But that does make our expressions a little different between, even parts of England, let alone, parts way across the world. What these are called sometimes, we do know about these sorts of things. They're called display rules that even if a smile is a kind of an interpretable smile in different cultures, the magnitude of that smile can differ between parts of the culture, right? So the magnitude of the Queen's smile versus Meghan's smile is really very striking. And the magnitude of the smiles in downtown London versus the outskirts and the rural areas of London is very noticeable. And it's something that also occurs, across different cultures as well. And so, I should probably get rid of this. I don't know if it's true anymore, but you do see a difference in strength of expressions. I also have strength of emotion there, and I'm not going to test you on this, don't worry about it, but some of you that might be interested in studying emotion, there is some evidence that that when people are asked to rate their own emotions to different sorts as reactions to different sorts of events, that people in rural areas will have a larger range of self-reported emotion than people in cities. Okay, I don't know if that's true. That's not my that's not my area of research, but for some of you, you might be interested in that. But what does seem to be true is this difference in expressions. Whether emotion truly comes with that is unclear, but I thought you'd find that interesting. So you do find differences. There's no question you find differences in different cultures in the extreme nature of different types of expressions. But you also find other things. So, for example, where this might seem to be an expression of disgust for us, maybe, those of us that grew up in the U.S., and this is an expression of anger, these are sometimes switched in other cultures. So I think Papua New Guinea might have been one of the places that this was switched. Very different culture where this was considered disgust and this was considered anger. Okay? And what you find generally is that even if within categories of positive and negative, they are sometimes switched, the general categories of positive and negative are pretty much true. So yes, a smile is generally interpreted as a smile everywhere in the world. Now, how extreme that smile is going to be different, that's for sure. But if you did show a picture like this to most people in the world, they would likely say that it was something like a smile. They might not say that this is disgust and this is anger, but the negative, the positive emotion of smile, they won't say in other words that this is happiness or this is happiness or this is happiness. Those will all be, if they are a little switched within a culture, they will all be switched within the category of negative emotions. Okay? And so that's considered to be universal. Just so I kind of thought that was an important thing to discuss because we learned this at different times in our schooling about the nature of expressions. But there is some universality, and it's interesting. Why would a smile be a smile across the entire world? Why would that be the case if it is the case? It's a really interesting question. But also, as I said, we're going to come now back to the idea that a lot of our ability to process expressions can happen at a subliminal level. So expressions can be subliminally perceived, even if we don't know consciously the expression that we are recognizing, that we are perceiving. So here's how this works. Usually it's not even an experiment that people think involve facial expression. So this is, it's not like that Mick Jagger, Saddam Hussein experiment where people were told they would be seeing very, very quick sort of images of faces. In this set of experiments, people don't even know they're looking at faces. They have no idea that they're looking at faces. Instead, they're asked to do things like rate how aesthetically pleasing they think that Chinese character, if it is in fact a Chinese character, might be. I don't know if this is a real Chinese character or something like that, but they would be shown this and just asked on a scale from 1 to 10 how aesthetically pleasing they think this is. It's kind of a weird thing to do, but they'll be shown some that are more or less symmetric, or maybe a little odd, or maybe have some sort of kind of flair to them, I would say. And the one we're looking at now kind of does have some sort of flair to it, and I would say that's kind of a nice looking one. But as it turns out, if you were in this experiment, you would be shown this character and be asked to make a judgment. But right before you were shown this character, you would actually get one of these subliminally presented faces. And if the subliminally presented face looked like this, it was a smiling face, versus it looked like this, a sad face, that subliminally presented face would have an effect on your aesthetic judgment of that character. As you might expect, you're sitting there, you're looking at that character, and a flash happens, and you're being shown that smiling face, but at the level below your consciousness, you'd be more likely to rate that figure, that character, as positive. If, on the other hand, you got the frowny face, again, at a subliminal level, you have no conscious recognition of seeing a face at all, you would rate that figure, that Chinese character, as more negative. Okay, and they go through the entire experiment just thinking that the whole experiment's about rating characters. And they're asked, did you ever see any other images besides the characters? They say no. Every once in a while, it looked like the computer screen glitched, but no, I just saw these images. Say, did you ever see faces? Absolutely not. I didn't see a face through the entire experiment. But the faces have a systematic influence over the aesthetic judgments of the character, despite being shown at an unconscious level. It's also being shown to have effects on hypothetical decisions, so on kind of making judgments concerning hypothetical safety, as an example. So maybe you're shown this picture here on the right next to the Chinese character, and just to kind of put you in the mood for a hypothetical situation. And you're told, okay, imagine yourself walking down a street, a dark street, very, very late at night. There are very few people around, and you hear some footsteps from behind you. Do you cross the street, or you can just continue walking? What's your sort of judgment here in terms of your safety? And different people will say different things. Depending on how you feel, depending on your health, all that sort of stuff. But you can influence to some degree whether people will say they'll continue walking down the street without a problem, or, yeah, I'll probably cross the street, it's late at night, by showing them subliminal faces first. And if you show them a smiling face, they're going to be more likely to say that they'll continue on the path. Or if you show them a subliminal angry face, they'll be more likely to say that they'll cross the street. Now, again, these are very subtle effects. If you're a person who's normally going to cross the street, yeah, you probably will say that you're going to cross the street. But in other hypothetical situations, you might be, I can't remember what the other ones were, but you might be, a little bit more on the fence. The image that you're shown, again, subliminally, you don't recognize faces at all. You're never seeing consciously seeing a face. It can have an influence on the sort of decisions, the hypothetical decisions you'll make that are posed in the experiment. So again, before you're shown this image of the dark street, a flash happens on the screen. If you're lucky, you see it, and most people don't. But as we know, that flash is actually either a happy face or an angry face being shown at you, and it does affect your decisions. And finally, as you can see on the slide there, it does have a subtle and very brief effect on self-rated mood. So if you are seeing, say maybe it's a different experiment completely now, where I don't know what the kind of trick stimuli are, where you think you're doing one thing but you're doing something else. So you're rating characters again, and after every 5 characters you're asked to rate your mood or something like that. This time, though, what's going to happen right before you're asked to rate your mood, that's when that flash on the screen is going to happen. You're shown a subliminal face, not consciously aware of it. It will have a very subtle but predictable effect on your mood. So if you see that happy face, or you're presented that happy face at an unconscious level, you might rate your self-mood as a tiny bit happier than if you saw that frowny face being presented again at an unconscious level. So your brain does process face information so efficiently, so effectively, that it can have effects even when you're unaware of seeing a face. Very, very cool, I think. Okay. That ends the class for today, and we'll continue talking about this stuff next Tuesday. Have a good weekend.